The wind rolls across the damp soil of East Anglia, whispering over ancient graves few living souls ever see. It brushes the worn edges of burial mounds, slips through the slats of wooden crosses long reclaimed by earth, and carries with it something older than words, the memory of lives buried beneath centuries of silence. For most of recorded history, the story of England began with kings and conquests, with Bede's chronicles and medieval myths. Names like Hengist and Horsa are etched into the national memory, draped in legend. We were told of great Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, sailing across the gray North Sea, arriving on the shores of post-Roman Britain to forge a new world. Some believed it was a hostile takeover. Others called it a cultural renaissance. But in every version, one truth seemed to remain. This was the moment England was born. And yet, what if that moment, as grand as it sounds, isn't quite what we imagined? For centuries, no one could say for certain. The written record was fragmented, steeped in politics and myth. Archaeology could only hint at patterns in pottery, sword styles, and sunken graves. It was compelling, but never conclusive. For a long time, the English identity remained a mystery sealed in soil, cloaked in centuries of guesswork. Until now. With the advent of ancient DNA analysis, science did something history never could. It gave the dead a voice. And when they spoke, what they said overturned everything. Because what we've discovered is that buried beneath the rolling hills of England lies a bloodline that doesn't just link us to the Saxon invaders. It shows us that their arrival was not myth. It was real. And not only that, it was far more extensive, more transformative, more human, than anything the old chronicles ever dared to say. This is the hidden bloodline of the English. A silent ancestry, stitched into bone and whispered through generations. An origin story not of kings, but of mothers and fathers, daughters and sons, people who crossed the sea not in legend, but in life. They came. They stayed. They became us. For generations, we believed the story was already written, that after the Romans turned their backs on Britain and left its fractured provinces behind, shadowy figures from across the North Sea arrived to seize a broken land. They were warriors, we were told, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, tearing through the chaos like fire through dry brush. That the native Britons, scattered and divided, were either pushed into the misty highlands or absorbed into this rising Anglo-Saxon tide. So said the chroniclers. So echoed the textbooks. But what if this narrative, the one taught in schools, recited in documentaries, whispered through national pride, was more theater than truth? It was the monk Bede, writing in the 8th century, who gave this migration its most enduring shape. He described whole tribes arriving in Britain at the invitation of local kings, bringing with them not just their weapons, but their wives, their children, their gods. From these migrants, Bede claimed, sprang the very roots of the English people. Yet Bede's England was not our England. His story was written with an agenda, to establish identity, to draw lines between pagan past and Christian present, to give the English church a noble, foreign lineage. He was not a scientist. He had no bone to test, no genome to map. His words were never meant as data. And yet, for centuries, they stood unchallenged. Historians and archaeologists began to question them. Some pointed to the sparse archaeological evidence for mass migration. Grave styles varied, but could they really prove invasion? Others noticed the persistence of Romano-British names and customs well after the supposed Saxon arrival. A new theory emerged. Maybe there had been no great flood of foreigners, just a small elite class asserting dominance over the native population. This model of elite transfer became popular. It explained how a Germanic language could spread without needing a full-scale population replacement. It aligned with the archaeological caution of the late 20th century, and for a while it seemed enough. But deep down, the questions lingered. If the Anglo-Saxon arrival was merely an illusion of power, why did the English gene pool begin to look so different from the Welsh and the Scots? Why did Eastern England, and not just in names or dialects, feel genetically other? How could a few hundred nobles reshape the very DNA of a nation? The tools of the past, pottery shards, burial rites, sword hilts, could only whisper. What we needed was the voice of the people themselves. Not in ink, in code, in molecules. For decades, geneticists tried to answer this using modern DNA. But the data was murky. The genetic ties between Northwestern Europeans are tight, tangled by centuries of movement. The signals of the past had faded, and so we guessed. We debated. We circled the same unresolved map, until something changed. Ancient DNA, direct sequencing of long-dead individuals, transformed a field built on theory into one of evidence. For the first time, scientists weren't inferring ancestry from modern genes. They were pulling it from the bones of those who lived through the migration itself. What we thought we knew was about to be rewritten, not with pens, but with the precision of genetic memory. Beneath the surface of ancient cemeteries, hidden in bone dust and the crumbling silence of time, a new language has been uncovered. Not Latin, not Old English, but something far more permanent. It is the language of DNA. And for the first time in history, this language has begun to speak. The revolution came quietly. No battle cry, no archaeological fanfare. Just a laboratory hum, a bone fragment, and the sequencing of a genome that hadn't stirred in over 1,500 years. What followed shattered centuries of speculation. Teams of researchers, armed not with shovels but with algorithms, extracted DNA from nearly 500 individuals, men, women, and children buried across England, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark. These weren't chosen at random. They were deliberately selected across time, from the end of Roman Britain, through the earliest Saxon cemeteries, deep into the heart of the Middle Ages. The question was simple. Who were these people? The answers, anything but. When their genetic code was compared to that of modern Europeans, a clear pattern emerged. A powerful signal tied early medieval English individuals, not to the indigenous populations of the British Isles, but to the lands across the North Sea, to Lower Saxony, to the Jutland Peninsula, to the northern coasts of the Netherlands. The scale was staggering. In eastern England, entire cemeteries revealed ancestry profiles where up to 76% of an individual's DNA matched populations from continental northern Europe. This wasn't a trickle of foreign blood. This was a demographic transformation. And the evidence wasn't abstract. It lived in real people, like those buried at Hatherdean Close in Cambridgeshire, where side by side lay individuals with wholly continental ancestry and others with none. Some graves held migrants, others natives, and between them, a growing number of people born of both worlds. This was the moment migration stopped being myth and became measurable. But it wasn't just about numbers. The very fabric of these ancient genomes revealed secrets invisible to the naked eye. At the cemetery of Dover Buckland, researchers traced a family across generations. The patriarch and matriarch, pure continental ancestry. Their daughter, a mix, her genes pulled from both Saxon and native British lineages. And her children, a perfect fusion. That kind of intergenerational data tells a different story than invasion. It speaks of settlement, of continuity, of families who arrived, stayed, and became something new. And in site after site, that story repeats with astonishing clarity. Even the tools used to analyze this ancestry evolved. Software like Locator mapped individuals, not just by their DNA, but by their most likely place of origin, pinpointing many of them back to that narrow corridor along the North Sea, from Friesland to Holstein, from Saxony to southern Denmark. What once took decades of archaeological interpretation now takes hours of computational modeling and produces answers grounded in the ancient biology of real people. The genome, it turns out, is the most honest historian of all. Long before the English language found its voice, before kingdoms rose from mist-covered fields, there existed an invisible corridor stretching across the restless waters of the North Sea. A current not of ships or swords, but of people, generations of them, carrying with them ancestry, identity, and the quiet force of biological continuity. When the genome data from early medieval Britain was placed alongside samples from continental Europe, a revelation took shape. The migrants who arrived in England didn't come from one isolated region. Their DNA reflected a seamless belt of ancestry, running from the northern Netherlands through coastal Germany and into Denmark. A genetic continuum, uninterrupted, unbroken, and remarkably uniform. It wasn't just the genetic code that linked them. It was their burial rites, their jewelry, even the architecture of their homes. From Frisia to East Anglia, the same types of sunken featured buildings appear, the same brooch designs, the same funerary customs. Culture and ancestry moved in lockstep across the sea. But this wasn't the handiwork of a single tribe or a defined ethnic group. There was no genetic fingerprint exclusive to the Angles or the Saxons. Instead, what emerged was a broader ancestral identity, one forged across centuries of interaction along the North Sea's rim. The people who settled England were drawn from this shared northern stock, diverse in origin yet bound by common roots. This genetic fluidity explains why trying to pinpoint the exact homeland of the Anglo-Saxon migrants has always felt like chasing smoke. Their origins weren't confined to a single valley or forested region. Instead, their DNA reflects centuries of contact, mobility, and intermarriage among neighboring coastal communities, places where the sea didn't divide, but connected. And the most striking part? These continental migrants weren't genetically distinct from one another. Whether unearthed in Lower Saxony or East Anglia, the samples were statistically indistinguishable. The same gene flows, the same haplogroups, the same ancestry patterns. It's as if England's settlers were drawn from a single, vast human reservoir flowing along the coastlines of northwestern Europe. Even when cutting-edge software like QP-Wave was applied to test genetic similarity between early medieval English individuals and those from continental sites, the results pointed again and again to deep commonality. There were no sharp boundaries, no clear lines, only overlap, a blur of shared heritage etched into the genome. And when location prediction tools like Locator traced these early English individuals back to their points of origin, one pattern dominated. Most were mapped to the lowlands of northern Germany and the Netherlands. This wasn't random. It was geographical precision, confirming centuries of oral tradition and archaeological intuition, now validated by science. In this sense, the English gene pool was never forged in isolation. It was born from the sea, shaped by tides of migration, and molded by the gentle, persistent movement of people across the water. That's the quiet brilliance of this story. It doesn't rely on drama or invasion. It speaks through pattern, through proximity, through the deep, slow rhythm of ancestral drift, and the subtle pulse of shared identity carried across the waves. At first glance, a burial is just a burial, a body in the ground, some scattered artifacts, and the slow reclaiming of flesh by the earth. But when those remains are read like a record, when the bones themselves are decoded, something astonishing happens. They begin to speak. Not in riddles, not in myth, but in measurable, undeniable truth. And sometimes, what they say defies every rule we thought we understood. Take Dover Buckland, for example. On the surface, it's just another Anglo-Saxon cemetery. But beneath its quiet soil lies a family saga written in chromosomes. Through genome sequencing, researchers reconstructed a multi-generational lineage, a patriarch and matriarch with fully continental ancestry. Their daughter, genetically blended, half native British, half immigrant. Her children, inheriting this fusion, bridging two distinct populations. This wasn't cultural assimilation. It was genetic integration, carried out within a single household, buried in one place, across 4 generations. And the grave goods? They weren't reserved for one side of the family. Brooches, beads, weapons, they appear with both local and migrant descendants. Social status didn't seem bound to blood origin. It followed something more nuanced, more personal. This wasn't an isolated case. At West Heslington, the rules bent again. There, a teenage boy was buried with an equal-arm brooch, beads, and a blade, a combination that challenges every assumption about gender, status, and cultural identity. His genome revealed him as biologically male, yet his burial reflected a mix of traditionally female and warrior-associated objects. It wasn't just his genes that blurred boundaries. It was his role, his identity, perhaps his entire place within his community. And then there's Oakington. Grave 80 held a woman with mostly native British ancestry. She was buried with a cow, an extraordinarily rare and expensive offering. Alongside that were silver disc brooches and a fine chatelaine. Her burial under a barrow suggested wealth, reverence, and memory. But her DNA told a different story. She wasn't descended from continental migrants at all. So what does that mean? That ancestry didn't dictate honor. That status could be earned, not inherited. Or perhaps that, in some corners of early medieval England, local lineage still commanded deep respect. The pattern only becomes more complex at Appledown. There, the orientation of the graves, the presence of artifacts, and even spatial organization within the cemetery showed clear distinctions. Individuals with continental ancestry were more frequently buried east to west, toward the center of the site, while those with native ancestry trended toward the edges, with a north-south axis. These weren't just subtle gestures. They were spatial statements, hinting at an invisible hierarchy based on genetic background. But the rules were never universal. At Hatherdean Close, migrants and locals were buried side by side, with overlapping status markers. Some graves held swords, others rings, others nothing at all. One plot might contain a first-generation continental male with a weapon, just meters away, a British-descended child with beads and amulets. The landscape becomes a mosaic of identity, not a hierarchy. What all of this reveals is simple, but profound. The Anglo-Saxon migration wasn't just a biological event. It was a social experiment, one that played out across families, generations, and burial grounds. Integration didn't follow a script. It was inconsistent, site-specific, and deeply human. And in that inconsistency lies the real story. Because history isn't shaped by rules. It's shaped by people. And people, in life and in death, always find ways to break the mold. In the vast web of human ancestry, patterns often repeat. Populations rise, mix, fade, and return. Migrations leave signatures. Empires come and go. But every so often, a genetic footprint emerges that doesn't just echo the past, it redefines it. The Anglo-Saxon genome is one such anomaly. Not because it's dominant, not because it's ancient, but because it's strangely enduring and biologically unique in the way it rewrote an entire region's identity. What makes Anglo-Saxon DNA truly distinct isn't just its origin. It's the scale and symmetry of its transformation. In most historic migrations, you see asymmetry. Soldiers arriving, local women assimilating, power flowing in one direction. But here, the data paints a different portrait. Across early medieval cemeteries in England, especially in the east and southeast, the genetic evidence reveals an almost balanced influx, men and women, both arriving from across the North Sea. Whole family units, not just raiders or elite bands. The genome doesn't lie. Both maternal mitochondrial DNA and paternal Y chromosomes were reshaped dramatically during this era. Before the 5th century, the male lineage across Britain was overwhelmingly dominated by R1b, P312, particularly the RL21 branch, a genetic hallmark of Western Celtic populations. But by the time the Anglo-Saxon migration had left its mark, that pattern had been almost entirely replaced in many regions. In its place came something else. Y chromosome haplogroups like R1AM420, I1M253, and R1b, U106, lineages commonly found in Scandinavia, northern Germany, and the Netherlands. Notably, I1M253 was completely absent in pre-migration Britain, yet it emerged in over a third of male burials from the early medieval period. These were not minor additions. They were structural shifts. But what's even more remarkable is how the autosomal genome, the sum of one's total ancestry, mirrored this turnover almost perfectly. That level of concordance between the male line and the rest of the genetic code is rare. It implies that both genders were equally present and equally involved in shaping the next generation. There was no overwhelming male dominance or forced assimilation. Even the X chromosome, which can reveal subtle gender imbalances in admixture events, showed no major bias. The implication? This was not just conquest. It was colonization in the truest sense, a movement of communities, not just armies. Layered onto this is the striking genetic homogeneity found among the migrants themselves. Whether the remains were pulled from East Anglia or from across the sea in Lower Saxony, their DNA was astonishingly similar. Across hundreds of kilometers, across dozens of sites, the same patterns held. This suggests a shared ancestry source, not scattered tribes, but interconnected populations migrating from a coherent, genetically stable zone. And yet, even as this continental DNA saturated much of England's east, It did not erase what came before. Instead, it blended, and in doing so, it created something new. That fusion is the core of what makes Anglo-Saxon DNA so unique. It's not just where it came from, it's what it became. A hybrid identity. A new genetic lineage that didn't simply overwrite the native British genome, but rewrote it with precision, consistency, and depth. More than any other migration event in British pre-modern history. This wasn't an episode. It was an origin. There was one final surprise hiding in the data. A subtle thread, nearly invisible at first, like a whispered accent in a crowded room. It didn't come from Saxony, or Denmark, or the Netherlands. It came from somewhere else entirely. From the south. From across the Channel. From the lands of the ancient Franks. It wasn't supposed to be there. For years, the focus of post-Roman migration studies had been locked onto the North Sea. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, their legacy was clear, their genetic imprint undeniable. But as scientists pushed deeper into the genome of early medieval English individuals, a new ancestral component emerged. One that didn't match the continental North. Instead, it aligned most closely with the DNA of Iron Age France. At first, this seemed like a glitch, an anomaly in the models. But as site after site confirmed its presence, the pattern grew impossible to ignore, particularly in southern and southeastern England, places like Kent, Sussex, and parts of Hampshire. Entire clusters of early burials carried genetic signatures that tied them not to Scandinavia or the Germanic coast, but to Gaulish territory, not modern French per se, but to ancient groups from regions that now include France, Belgium, and parts of Western Germany. These weren't Viking echoes, or later Norman imports. This ancestry was already present in the early medieval period, woven into the fabric of communities that, on the surface, looked entirely Anglo-Saxon. This discovery reframed the narrative. Artifacts had long hinted at connections to Frankish culture. The brooches, the belt buckles, the glass beads, many bore stylistic influences from Merovingian France. But now, for the first time, DNA confirmed that some of these cultural links weren't just trade. They were personal. Migrants didn't only come from the east, they came from the south as well. In Eastry and Appledown, individuals were uncovered who carried no detectable North Sea ancestry, yet had clear genetic ties to Iron Age Gaul. And they weren't outliers. In some areas, this French-aligned ancestry composed over 40% of the total genetic profile. The implications are profound. This wasn't a case of a secondary migration wave. It was something more organic, more continuous, a long-standing corridor of mobility, marriages, kinship, trade, perhaps even political alliances between southern Britain and Frankish territories. The Channel, like the North Sea, wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge. And it didn't stop in the early Middle Ages. That same French-linked ancestry appears in modern-day English genomes, especially in the southeast. When researchers tried to model the present-day English population using only local Iron Age and North Sea migrant sources, the results didn't add up. But when Iron Age France was added to the equation, everything clicked. Even after the Norman conquest, even after centuries of internal migration, that old connection, forged in the early medieval shadows, still echoes in the blood of millions. What began as an unexpected data point has now become one of the most compelling dimensions of England's genetic story. A quiet reminder that history is rarely linear, and identity is never simple. The Anglo-Saxon narrative didn't just run from east to west. It stretched south, into Frankish lands, into forgotten alliances, into families whose names are lost, but whose DNA endures.